Welcome back. We've got some breaking news we're following this hour. Just a short time ago, the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson met with Russia's President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Top of the agenda, of course, is the crisis in Syria. Relations between Washington and Moscow have been strained over that American strike at a Syrian air base last week. We are expecting Tillerson and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to hold a news conference pretty soon. Let's go straight to our senior UN correspondent, Richard Roth. Richard, there were so many questions about whether Rex Tillerson would indeed meet with President Putin. It was looking like it wasn't going to happen, which would have been highly unusual.
And he was awarded a Russian Friendship Medal a few years ago when he was the leader of ExxonMobil. Maybe not the way to treat a guest like that, but things change. And through the oddity of scheduling, Tillerson is in Moscow and now meeting with Putin, just as the UN Security Council here at the UN is having a somewhat ferocious debate on Syria. And Syria will be the main topic of the Tillerson meeting with Putin and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. The foreign minister meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State earlier. It's not known if any positions are going to change, because here in a few hours at the UN Security Council, Russia is expected to veto a proposed resolution by the U.S. and others to condemn that chemical weapons attack in Syria on April 4th and to request and order Syrian government officials to comply with an outside investigation, getting interviews with helicopter pilots and flight logs regarding who might have been in the air over that Syrian town. For Rex Tillerson, definitely his most significant foreign mission right now by the new U.S. Secretary of State. And President Putin, of course, along with his deputy Russian here, who is speaking, who just spoke here at the UN, have denounced U.S. and Western intentions in Syria, claiming that the West has been supporting terrorists and outside groups to overthrow Assad, and that everybody should get together for the good of Syria. Here in the United Nations, very pointed remarks by the deputy Russian a short time ago, pointing his finger at U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley, saying, "Look at me. You're not even listening to this political briefing here. Stop with the insults." Very upgraded, offensive series of remarks by on the offense. I wouldn't call them offensive. By the Russian here. Nikki Haley will speak in a matter of minutes. So on two fronts, in Moscow and here at the UN, 6 years into a civil war with hundreds of thousands dead, Syria remains a major crisis point. Linda.
A major crisis point, and also a major point of division between Washington and Moscow. It was hoped when President Trump came to office, he and his team hoped to have warmer relations with Moscow. And we haven't seen that so far. We've seen that division growing.
Well, I think anything with the Trump administration, no matter which side you're on, you would say things could be unpredictable. They have proven that way. Nobody really knows what level of relationship President Trump had in the past with the Russians or President Putin. But through events here and elsewhere, publicly, the Trump administration has been condemning the Russian actions in Syria and Ukraine. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador, either on her own or in coordination with Trump and others, has been one of the most forceful out in front condemning Moscow's actions. You haven't heard President Trump vocally condemn Russia that much. It's been people like Tillerson and Haley. Both of those two people, of course, just a few weeks ago, thought Syria could be decided by its own people. Following the chemical weapons attack, a change in tune, a much harsher criticism of Russia. It would be interesting to be a fly on the wall, of course, in that Tillerson-Putin meeting right now.
Yeah, it certainly would be. And just for the viewers that have just joined us, just to recap, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has met with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was thought that the two wouldn't meet. The Russian president, of course, has bestowed the Order of Friendship on Rex Tillerson in his former role as the CEO of ExxonMobil. And this meeting was not expected to happen. We have our correspondent, our bureau chief in Moscow, standing by, Matthew Chance. Matthew, this was seen as a snub when it was thought that the two would not meet. Certainly things, can we make that things have changed there, that things may have improved?
Well, I certainly think it would have been interpreted as a snub had a meeting between Rex Tillerson and Vladimir Putin not taken place, given that this is the Secretary of State's first visit to Moscow in that official capacity. But the fact is it did happen, and so it wasn't a snub. But at the same time, I'm not sure we should read too much into it in terms of what this means for the relationship between the United States and Russia. Certainly, this meeting that was had between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Rex Tillerson would have been a very tense one. We don't know what the details of it were yet. We're expecting a joint press conference with Lavrov and Tillerson over the next hour or so. Certainly, journalists are gathering to hear those two figures speak. But Rex Tillerson came to Russia, remember, with the idea of recommending, advising, telling the Russians to back away from their ally in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, saying that it wasn't any longer in Russia's national interest, that they were on the wrong side of history, is how it's been characterized elsewhere. The reception for that kind of proposal will not have been very, very positive, because Russia has invested billions of dollars and millions of tons worth of military hardware in supporting the Assad regime in Syria. And President Putin, particularly, has invested a very high degree of personal prestige and national prestige in making sure that Bashar al-Assad does not fall and his regime continues, which is a pro-Russian regime, continues inside Syria. The idea that the Russians, that the Kremlin was going to easily turn their backs on that ally is pretty far-fetched, and I expect that's the message that Rex Tillerson will have received from his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, and indeed from Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin, where they've been meeting over the course of the last several minutes at least.
Rex Tillerson, of course, has only been in this role as Secretary of State for a few weeks, but he has had a history with Russia. He worked there as CEO, as head of ExxonMobil for quite some time. And at one stage, President Putin called him a friend.
Well, he called him a friend in the sense that he awarded him Russia's top friendship medal, the Order of Friendship. When Rex Tillerson was the CEO of Exxon, he did billions of dollars worth of trade deals with Russia, and he was obviously very well liked for that reason amongst the upper echelons of the Kremlin. And Putin himself pinned that Order of Friendship medal on Rex Tillerson back in 2013. But of course, he's here in Moscow today in a very different capacity. The Russians, the Kremlin, may have expected the Trump administration and Rex Tillerson to have been a friend of Russia, to have been sympathetic to the Russian point of view, the Russian view of the world. But none of that has come to pass. None of these ideas that Trump elaborated on when he was the candidate, of cooperating with Russia on international terrorism, of joining with it in the conflict of Syria, in criticising NATO, in recognising Crimea, potentially, which was annexed by Russia in 2014 from Ukraine, as a legitimate part of Russia. None of that came to pass. And so, as Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson is in a very different position to the one he occupied in past years, when he was a favourite of the Kremlin. Now he's come to Moscow as an adversary of the Kremlin, and I think he will notice that difference very clearly in those very intensive meetings with the Russian president and with the Russian foreign minister.
And Rex Tillerson already has met and will meet again with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. Sergei Lavrov, of course, has been in that role since 2004. What's your reading of how their meeting so far has played out?
Yes, he's been in that role since 2004. And of course, before that, he was the Russian permanent representative to the United Nations. And so he was the Russian ambassador to the UN. So he's got a long-standing history of diplomacy from the Russian perspective. And that means, of course, he's very focused and very knowledgeable about what Russia wants and what Russia intends to achieve. And, you know, all foreign ministers, all secretaries of state, when they're in the company of Sergei Lavrov, are, you know, kind of impressed, I think, by his depth of knowledge of diplomacy and of Russian diplomacy and of Russian objectives in particular. And I expect Rex Tillerson is feeling exactly that. Look, I mean, again, Rex Tillerson came here with a view to trying to encourage Russia to back away from its ally in Syria. That's not something that the Russians have shown any inclination towards accepting, even in the light of the missile strikes, the 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles hitting that Syrian government airbase in the country. Even in the light of that, I suspect the Russians will be very reluctant to give any impression at this early stage in their relationship with the Trump administration that they're prepared to compromise on an issue which is to them a very, very big one.
And just to recap for viewers that have just joined us, US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was a meeting that was not expected to happen. It has taken place, and we are expected to hear from the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, along with Rex Tillerson. They are expected to hold a press conference shortly. Just back to Matthew. On some of the comments we've heard so far from the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, it appears that, there has been some criticism of the Trump administration failing to fill positions quickly in the State Department, and Sergei Lavrov appeared to take a swipe about that.
Yeah, he's criticised the United States for that. He's also, I think his most barbed criticism, though, was when he said what he wanted to, I'm paraphrasing him, but what he wanted to find out from this meeting with Rex Tillerson is essentially what the US policy was. And I think he was probably speaking for a lot of people who are watching the Trump administration at the moment and watching them sort of move between different policies. They've been quite inconsistent on the issue of just Syria, never mind other issues. And what Sergei Lavrov said is that one of the things, the most important thing that he wants out of this meeting with Rex Tillerson is a sense of what the Trump administration's policy is when it comes to Syria. But I think he was also talking about a range of other issues as well. Remember, as I mentioned, candidate Trump, when he was campaigning for the presidency in the United States, said all sorts of things that were broadly interpreted as being pro-Russian. In fact, he's being investigated. His administration is being investigated for the extent to which there was collusion with the Russian government. He's being investigated by the Congress, by the Senate and the House of Representatives. But he said he would look again at recognising Crimea. He said he would cooperate with Russia over international terrorism. He said he would cooperate with Russia on the war in Syria. He criticised NATO for being obsolete, in his words. All of this, of course, was music to the ears of the Kremlin, and none of it came to pass. And so the Russians, the Kremlin, the foreign ministry, they've been left confused as to what it is that the Trump administration stands for. And hopefully Rex Tillerson will have been able to sort of fill in some of the gaps to his Russian counterpart.
All right, Matthew Chance, just stand by for us in Moscow. For viewers just joining us, Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, is in Moscow meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He is expected to urge Russia to end its support for Bashar al-Assad. We have our correspondents standing by around the world. We have Nick Robertson joining us from London, our senior international diplomatic editor. We also have Elise Labbett joining us from Washington. First, I want to go to Nick. You've been covering the G7 summit over the past few days. Tell us about the message that you think Rex Tillerson will be trying to make to President Putin.
Well, he'll want to certainly appear that the allies behind the United States are united, because he'll be aware that Putin and Lavrov will do everything they can to leverage any small gap between the unity there to further their aims in all of this. He came away with a broad agreement and understanding that the strike that the United States took in Syria because of the use of chemical weapons by Assad was a correct measure. We just heard from the French ambassador to the United Nations saying words to the effect of this was a long overdue, this was something that was long overdue, and this calling Russia to account on its association with Assad was long overdue. There was broad agreement that the existing sanctions over Ukraine should stay in place. There wasn't an agreement to increase sanctions on Russia. That was framed as not wanting to put Russia into a diplomatic corner. There certainly was, the British Foreign Secretary wanted there to be additional sanctions, but the idea was that would just hamper Secretary Tillerson. I think where Tillerson sort of has that big support, is the very fact that he met with those allies. But like Russia, those allies kind of want to know what are some of the blanks in the US policy towards Syria. The sea change that they saw take place last week, putting Assad in the crosshairs, if you will, rather than ISIS. It's been reframed as Tillerson saying ISIS is the #1 issue for the United States in Iraq and Syria. It is the primary national security issue for the United States right now, it goes some way to answer that. But the idea that Tillerson suddenly got an awful lot of leverage coming out of the G7 that he could take to Moscow just didn't happen. But I do get the sense, just by the sheer volume of rhetoric and the sheer cadence and terminology used in the language that we're hearing from the Kremlin right now, describing this as perhaps the worst in relationship since the Cold War, they are clearly putting up, as Matthew is so well describing, such a very, very strong pushback to the United States. Where it goes from here, not only a concern for the Kremlin, but also for all those allies who were there in Lucca at the G7 and the additional Gulf allies as well, because it just isn't clear to anyone at the moment quite what the next move from Trump will be. What in essence is happening here is the Kremlin is calling President Trump's bluff, if you will. Don't push again.
Nick, I'm just going to interrupt you. President Putin is now speaking. Let's listen in.
At the working level, and particularly militarily, has certainly not got any better. It's degraded.
You appear to have some problems with that sound. I just want to go to Nikki Haley, who's speaking at the United Nations Security Council.
Planes drop another barrel bomb on civilians, and every time Assad tries to starve another community to death. People, not just in the West, but across the Middle East and the world, are speaking out against Assad's brutality. It is long past time for Russia to stop covering for Assad. It is long past time for Russia to push seriously for peace and not continue to be part of the problem. The road to peace is long. We won't get a political solution overnight. But we can start by working together to actually de-escalate the conflict.